Okay, so this is our webinar on urban form and put on by Nelson Tasman Climate Forum as part of our work on the whole range of climate issues: mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and care for all species. And our speaker today is Timo Neubauer, and I'll tell you a little of Timo's story because it sets a context for what you're about to hear. Timo has had an international career in urban design. He's worked in Germany and other European countries, Abu Dhabi. He's worked for Jasmax in Auckland, where he focused on the city rail link. Feeling a little jaded by the resistance to good urban design in New Zealand, Timo shifted to agritourism and has in our area a pear orchard, farm animals, a regenerating wetland, and he had a bucolic lifestyle. But events jolted Timo. A few years back, Waka Kotahi insisted that several beautiful trees on High Street, Motueka, had to come down, and Timo had a knowledge base to be able to assert that this was unnecessary. He took them to the Ombudsman with the result that some of the trees were saved, and every time I go into Motueka, I can thank Timo for that. Then the Richmond South Greenland Development Project began, and again, Timo had relevant knowledge to contest greenfield development. He made the decision to step back into the arena to speak out. Next, the combined regions shaped their future development plan, and they particularly made ample allocation to greenfield development. Though desiring a quiet life, Timo again felt a moral imperative to act. He and others in the field formed the group Nelson Tasman 2050, talked to councillors and made joint submissions under that name. Members of that group were also instrumental in sparking the highly popular What If series in Nelson, and Timo spoke at one of these events. He's in a unique position to speak with a broad and deep knowledge of urban design, but unconstrained by needing to avoid annoying an employer. Recognizing this, Timo has put himself at service of the common good. And we thank you for this, Timo, and we're eager to hear what you have to say. But before we go on to that, I want to point out that facilitating our questions on this presentation is Peter Olorenshaw, whose day job is as a registered eco-architect. And beyond that, Peter has long-standing interest in transport, urban form, and has been a convener of Nelson Sustainable Transport Group, or NELSUST, since 2007. And I want you to picture Peter on his honeymoon on a bicycle. And as he currently lives just 8 minutes by bicycle from Nelson Cathedral. In the question period, Peter will facilitate that, but would you put your questions, please, in the chat? And you can start putting them in at any time during the presentation, and Peter will select from those questions to put them to Timo. Okay, over to Timo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for that very kind introduction. If I may, just a very quick correction on the Motueka street trees. I can't really claim to have anything to do with the fact that some of those trees remain. That is entirely due to the community of Motueka that made a really big stand about those trees. But in the end, unfortunately, the Ombudsman found that Waka Kotahi can pretty much do whatever they want in their land, which is slightly frustrating, but that's probably material for another webinar. So on this one, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the Climate Action Week. I'm really honored to be invited, and realize that what I am talking about is a little bit of an odd one out, because it's very high level, and there are actually very few action points for individuals to take from this. I mean, who really makes their decision on how and where they live on the basis of how much carbon they'll produce? I mean, that'll be much more along lines of, you know, what sort of lifestyle can I have? How easy is it for me to get to work? How much is it going to cost? But keeping that in mind, I believe that this high-level information is really important to consider at our next elections, and thinking about the policy proposals that our politicians are going to be putting forward. So when they're talking about, you know, producing or enabling a lot more housing and cheap housing, then maybe this will enable some people to now think about how are they proposing to deliver that, and where will this housing be. And maybe it also helps some of our community to appreciate some of our council's actions on the ground, and understand a little bit more why some of these things are happening. So let's jump straight in. Oh no, seems like my slides aren't working. Now they are. So first of all, a warning, I do tend to upset some people. That is partly because of what I have to say, but partly also for some people because I'm a German immigrant to this country, and with only a little bit more than 22 years living here, I've got the audacity to criticize some aspects of our Kiwi lifestyle. Some people seem to think that I want everybody to live like this, while I live my lavish lifestyle and tend to my guests here at the Pear Orchard Lodge. So if you would like to carry on thinking that, now would be a really good time to switch off. Have we got anybody left? Looks like there are some. Okay, so let's carry on. Now, my lecture is about my webinar is about the impact of urban form on our greenhouse gas emissions, which is a bit of a mouthful. So let's pull this one apart a little bit and think about what is urban form. So urban form is basically buildings. You know, what type of buildings are they connected? Are they standalone? What sort of street types have we got? You know, where are those elements located within the city? Are they in the center? Are they on the edge? So all of that is broadly called urban form. So now you're going to be asking, or some of you might, so what has that all got to do with greenhouse gas emissions? Because we don't really get told a lot about this. However, there are, you know, some locally more well-known scientists who do regularly post their opinion about this, and there's also the IPCC, so the International Panel on Climate Change, and scientists all around the world who actually believe that our urban form is one of our biggest contributors to our greenhouse gas emissions. And our greenhouse gas emissions per capita in New Zealand are actually quite big. If you can see this graph, you can see Australia and New Zealand, we're just sitting just behind the United States, and you know, worse than Russia per capita. That is pretty big, and maybe something that we should work on. Now, I'm not a researcher. When I worked as an urban designer, some of my work is about style and taste, but most of it is about solving problems. And in order to solve the problems correctly, I go back to research to find out how to do things to get the right effect. And so in a way, I just implement research. I'm more or less a messenger. But as you can all know, the life of a messenger is a bit tricky at times, because what happens if we don't like the message? I hope that this audience is a little bit kinder than some of the audience I'm dealing with occasionally on some Facebook community pages. But yeah. So in this case, our problem is really, how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And I just wanted to know, well, does urban form have something to do with it? And looked for research, and I did find something. Somebody else was already answering that, probably spending a few years of their time doing this. Now, let's go to Toronto in Canada, where Jonathan Norman was looking at the life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, comparing high and low residential density. Now, that was exactly what I was after. So what they were doing, they were looking at 2 case studies within the city of Toronto, here and there, and I assume that most of you will know as little about Toronto as I do. So that's why I thought I'd just quickly jump on Google Maps and figure out, what those neighborhoods actually look like. So here they are again. So we've got this one here and this one here, Melbourne, I think it's called, on the outskirts of. So let's just have a look at those. This is the low density case study, Melbourne. Looks to us, I would say, quite familiar. I mean, it's got detached single family housing, single use. This suburb is about 30 kilometers, a 30-minute drive from downtown Toronto. 30 minutes, I think these days you could say, is probably also the distance from Berryfields to Nelson, just to put this into context. And this is what it looks like. It's a little bit similar to what we've got here, except I can't even see a footpath here, lots of cars, single family houses. And then we've got a high density case study here, which is pretty much in the core of, or very close to the core of, Toronto. So you've got multi-story buildings, mixed use. You're within walking distance, or you're actually within downtown. You can see perimeter block urban form here, where you might have apartments or commercial offices in here, just enjoying this outlook to the inside of the block. Over here, you can even see a fresh food market, nice public park. So this is quite a different urban form. Just to see how it looks like, I would quite like to walk here. This is kind of what it looks like. There's the market. Maybe sometime in my life I can sit under one of these umbrellas. But yeah, that's the 2 case studies. And the major elements that Norman looked at here was the embedded carbon and construction materials for infrastructure, but also the houses themselves. So it's looking at the houses, the utilities, roads, everything that's involved in building these. So that would be space heating, how do you cook your food, could be cooling, all sorts. And then transportation. So that's, are you using your car, are you using public transport, are you walking? And now this is what they found. Quite staggering. If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions per person, look at the segment of transportation that's taken up in the low density urban form scenario. That is huge. and you can see the overall emissions per person are significantly higher than those measured in the high density scenario. Now, interestingly, if you go to this graph over here, you can see that the difference isn't actually quite as significant as it is on a per person basis. So what that tells me very clearly is that the high density option provides less square meters per person, so it's smaller units. You can see the building operations are quite similar on a per square meter basis. Materials even a little bit higher, a little bit more on a per square meter basis, which matches what I hear from the industry here. But in a way, that is irrelevant, because what's really important is this figure here, greenhouse gas emissions per person, per capita. So they found low density suburban development is more greenhouse gas intensive by a factor of 2 to 2.5 than high density urban core development. And they found that the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is by targeting transport emissions. Now, that was looking at 2 neighborhoods, right, in Canada. It could be a fluke, could be something specific about Toronto, why this comes out so significant. Never just trust one study. So I was looking around whether, there's some other research that's looking into a similar aspect. And there we go. Here's Edmonton. We're in Canada again. These guys were basically looking at variations in greenhouse gas emissions across neighborhoods. So very similar study as Norman did. But newer, this is from 2021. And they actually were much broader in the way they approached it. They were looking at 12 selected neighborhoods in Edmonton. They grouped them into 4 different neighborhood types. So you've got core neighborhoods right here in the center, the darker red. Then you've got mature neighborhoods in the periphery of the core. Then you've got your established neighborhoods around that, the yellow, and your developing neighborhoods on the periphery, the green ones. And again, I assume that most of you won't know Edmonton. I certainly don't. I'm not sure if I want to. So I basically jumped into Google Earth again to just give a little bit of an idea of what these neighborhoods look like that we're comparing. So you've got the core here, which it's clearly built in the 60s, or one of the core neighborhoods at least. But close to downtown, dense, mixed use, transit, and pedestrian oriented to a degree. I think there's probably some potential to improve still. Then you've got the mature neighborhoods. They're in the periphery of the core, lower densities, some mixed use, transit accessible, so you've got public transport there, and mostly single detached. So this is a little bit like maybe on Nelson South or the Remuera and Ponsonby of Auckland. And then you've got your established neighborhoods. Now we're already 12 kilometers out, 20 minutes commute to downtown, lower density than the mature neighborhoods. And out from there again, we get the developing neighborhoods. Now we're 20 kilometers out on average, 30 minutes commute. And interestingly, higher densities, higher dwelling densities, and a more balanced range of building types. So that's a little bit what we're seeing in berry fields now, where you can actually all of a sudden see, 2-story attached units popping up. Now, here are some attributes that are quite interesting of these 4 different neighborhoods. I've gone through and averaged, for instance, the private vehicle use for the various neighborhoods, and look at the difference here. In the core neighborhood, every second trip is basically done by car. If you move out to the developing neighborhoods, you almost have every trip done by car. So there's quite a difference in the profile there. And the other thing that is quite clear here is that the average dwelling size increases as you go out. Now, these guys found significant differences in the total emissions per capita across the neighborhoods. And those were primarily based on the floor area per person. So look at this graph here. As you can see, the larger the floor area, the higher the greenhouse gas emissions per person. But also the transport choices, transport options. So again, you can see the further you're away from any public transport, the higher the greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially, the core neighborhoods had the lowest emissions, and the developing neighborhoods at the very edge of town had by far the highest emissions. Quite clearly visible here, the transport emissions, for instance. So that matched exactly what Norman came up with, the first study that we looked at. Now, these guys were a bit, made some suggestions here about how we should move forward to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And they found that we need different building configurations that include smaller floor area per person, smaller unit sizes, fewer single detached units, and a multi-unit built form. They also felt that the reliance on private vehicles for the daily commutes is the major contributor. So all of these things are, in my view, connected. So, I mean, we've all heard not out, right? So does that mean the higher the beta? And, think of the Kaingaora development in Nelson's, for instance, which was that good? Or is there 2021? These guys, Jay Arahat and his gang, were looking at decoupling density from tallness, and again looked at the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So they looked at 4 settlement patterns from around the world. We all know this, that's a high density, high rise scenario. Think of Manhattan, think of Hong Kong Island. Then the low density high rise scenario, we still have tall buildings, but a lot more green space in between, a bit like Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse. And then the high density, which I take called low rise scenario. Now, for us, this is probably a little bit confusing, but they call this the high density low rise scenario, and that is pretty typical for any European city. They referenced Paris, but you can look at pretty much any city. If you look at the 19th century sort of extensions, they're all like this. We have 4 to 6 stories mainly, sometimes up to 10. And then the last one was the low density, anywhere up to 2 stories, of varying population sizes and land areas they made available. And this is their conclusion. So taller urban environments actually significantly increase the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is the high-rise scenario. And they found that low density urban environments, fairly unsurprisingly, significantly increase our land use. However, increasing urban density without significantly increasing our urban height reduces the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions while maximizing the population capacity. So they had the conclusion that high density, low rise environments like Paris or any of the other European examples are the best when looking at reducing whole life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. Now, by the way, these last images are not Paris. This is Hamburg, where I used to live. They also meet growing demand for urban space. So what has that all to do with Nelson Tasman? How are we going here? Are we all right? Let's have a look at our urban form. So I can see berry fields here, which looks very much like Richfield in Edmonton, or like Melbourne and Toronto. And we remember they didn't do overly well by comparison with other urban forms that exist. But there is a glimmer of hope. We can see here the Brett apartments, for instance, in town, or some other townhouses popping up. So there's a bit of hope, but I mean, this is not really scientific to base a judgment on, just what that looks like. So let's have a look at the stats and the metrics behind this that we learned are important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So first up, floor area per person. This is staggering. New Zealand has the second biggest houses in the world. We're only topped by Australia, who have even larger houses. And within New Zealand, Tasman offers the third biggest houses on average. Nelson is a little bit better in that regard. So that's not ideal for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. What about car use? Now in New Zealand, our average car use is 80%. Now think back of that study from Araha. From Edmonton. 80% was what you would see in the peripheral suburbs of Edmonton. For us, it's an average, so that includes core areas. And worst of all, our car use is actually increasing. In Nelson Marlborough, we're sitting on, Nelson Tasman, we're sitting on 77%, which is slightly below on New Zealand average. What about fewer standalone houses? Yes, Nelson is starting to turn the corner by the looks of it. We're starting to see more townhouses, flats, units, and other dwellings. Also a hell of a lot of retirement village units, which could be another problem, but that's probably something for another lecture. Tasman, not so much. That's pretty stable, just building houses. So where is our growth? Are we growing in the core or are we growing around the periphery? Now, from the Nelson Tasman Future Development Strategy, you can see that over the next 30 years, we're projecting that 53% of our growth will still be through greenfield expansion. Now, that includes rural residential, lifestyle blocks, and zoned but unrealized greenfield. The reality is that figure is probably going to be a bit higher than that because last time I looked, conversion of lifestyle blocks to standard residential was actually categorized as intensification. So that means sprawl in the Maitai Valley, sprawl in Richmond South, sprawl in Brightwater, sprawl in Wakefield, sprawl in Seaton Valley. And that is adding to what we see in the Wood, Bishopdale, Tahunanui, Stoke, Richmond, Berry Fields, Pattern Rise. You get the story. This is all sprawl already. So we're adding more sprawl to sprawl. The only areas in Nelson really that have a slightly different urban form are along small pockets around Rocks Road and in the city centre. Not ideal. But aren't councils reducing our emissions? Let's have a look at what they're doing. They're doing something. They are measuring their own operational emissions. So that's looking at landfill, waste, wastewater treatment plants, their own electricity, that sort of stuff. So just now bear with me, there'll be a few figures here, but they're really important to understand the magnitude of what we're talking about. So what the councils are measuring and actively trying to reduce is their operational greenhouse gas emissions. So you've got 12,500 tonnes of CO2 in Nelson and 21 odd tonnes in Tasman that they're dealing with. Just by comparison, our household greenhouse gas emissions, the stuff we've seen in the studies that's been measured, are about 70,000 in Nelson and 117,000 in Tasman. Quite a different number. And 93% of those are transport related. And we know why. And I think a lot of it is planning related. And who does the planning? The councils do the planning. But who's responsible? Councils tell us to save the planet and drive less and walk more. But that is all well and good, but it's really hard when every trip feels like you're walking the Camino de Santiago because everything is so far apart. It's just not convenient. While there are certainly some individual actions and some people who do the right thing, we cannot rely on a few individuals to actually get this right. I think this is something where we need some much bigger action that comes through our councils, through our planning. Now, this is not anybody important who said this here, but I strongly believe that until we create an urban form that invites walking, we will keep driving. So let's go back to these slightly dry figures, just to understand a little bit more what the magnitude of this is that we're talking about. So here are, again, our operational greenhouse gas emissions of our councils. They managed to save 3,500 tonnes in Nelson, which is quite a bit, if you consider that. Not so much in Tasman. Now, again, here are our household greenhouse gas emissions. Now, remember, we could have much lower emissions by a factor of 2 to 2.5. So just as a very broad brush, instead of the above, we could have figures as low as tonnes, which means a saving of about 110,000 across our region. Now put that into comparison with what the council is focusing on at the moment. That is 40 times the savings that they're actually focusing their attention on at the moment, every year. So where do we from here? We can, of course, say, I don't care. And we've all heard climate change is a hoax, or we're too small to make a difference. This is not how we like to live, or this is how it's always been, and I want my children to have the same experience, or simply it's never going to work here, or she'll be right. And the reality is, if as a society we adopt this position, there's absolutely nothing I or any other urban designers can do to help. However, I thought when we passed the Zero Carbon Act that as a society we had made a decision that we take climate change seriously and that we need to change things. It just seems to be a little bit unstuck in the implementation. So if we want to turn this ship around, I reckon we need to think about where we get the most bang for our buck, and we need to see that our councils actually measure the emissions impact from their town planning and link these findings to their annual carbon budgets and create a roadmap to 2050 when, according to the Zero Carbon Act, we're supposed to be carbon neutral. So that would then get us to a position where we probably won't see any more sprawl. We'll see a focus on well-designed intensification with smaller units, moderate height, more transport options. Now that is obviously a hell of an imposition, but it will get us lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower infrastructure costs, which means lower rates. It will get us less congestion. It will get us less energy use, which means less cost for every one of us at the pump. And as a bonus, a much more vibrant and livable city. So I'll finish this presentation with our mission statement from Nelson Tasman 2050. We believe that the Nelson Tasman region has the potential to become the most vibrant and livable region in our country, with the country's smallest environmental footprint. And that's me.
Well, thank you, Timo. That was fantastic. So many things there. Look, just briefly, initially, you showed a like a pie chart with various countries' emissions per capita, and you showed one that it was Australia and New Zealand. Was that jointly, or were they alongside each other?
That was jointly. And the fact is that our per capita emissions are pretty similar, and that's why they were grouped together. And, you know, because our population is relatively small, if you put us into a separate segment in there, it becomes a very difficult to see.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Someone, Bruce here says that he was born and spent 10 years in Toronto, where they had subway, electric streetcars, etc. In the downtown core. Despite this, they built 12 or more lane highways in the 60s, and the highways are always congested despite 1 million daily riders on the subway. You know, so it's sort of proof of the pudding, really, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you already presented this to the councils, and what was their response?
No, I have not made this presentation to the councils. Some of you might have seen a few of my opinion pieces. So my presentation today is actually puzzled together out of a number of these opinion pieces that I have placed in the Nelson Mail generally. So I think some people will be aware of it. I have had presentations to the council on separate issues. One would be about you know, how unaffordable our sprawl is. I made that just recently. So looking at infrastructure cost and how that's actually burdening you know, our councils and the rates. The greenhouse gas emissions, we touched on that quite heavily when we made a submission to the hearing panel on the future development strategy. But yeah, it seems like they have to compromise, of course, between various different views on this topic, and I'm not entirely sure how convinced they really are of the science. I mean, during the hearing process for the future development strategy, we encountered a few situations where councillors simply got wrong information from staff about exactly this, the greenhouse gas emissions per capita linked to different urban form. So yes, I mean, we have provided this information to the council. Whether it's actually got through to everybody, I doubt it.
Okay, thanks, Timo. Says Lindsay, is there a density sweet spot for public transport to work well?
Well, if it's simply public transport, and if we're only focusing on public transport, I mean, I'm not a transport planner, so I'm probably not the right person to answer it, but I would imagine the more people you've got in one spot, the better public transport is going to work. But I think the important thing that I wanted to point out through this presentation is that may work for public transport, but it doesn't necessarily work best to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Because if we do start to go above our 5-6 story height, or maybe even 10, if we go above that, we get into all sorts of trouble and of energy, of, you know, shifting people up and down, goods up and down, and the construction techniques used to build these high-rise buildings, that the actual greenhouse gas profile for those sort of neighborhoods is not as good as if you stay at a more manageable, moderate height.
I think the question was more like the Berryfield example is
Yes. Okay. Obviously,
perhaps not the right density
obviously what
for
we've got
a
here
sweet
with
spot
the
in public transport.
yes, obviously what we've got here with our extremely low density neighborhoods, you know, it is very hard to make public transport work because you usually deal with a 400-meter walking radius, and then it's a number of how many people do you capture within that radius, and you know, that's not an awful lot if you've got houses sitting on sections.
Yeah. Bruce asks, what explanation does the council give for their buckshot approach to development rather than expanding concentrically from the Nelson core?
Well, the argument that I hear a lot is, but this is what people want. So before every future development strategy, the council goes out and does a survey of, you know, how people want to live. And a lot of people basically say, oh, I would love to have my own house and a garden around it. Oh, and then they use that as evidence to say, well, you know, we have to provide more of this because that's what people want.
Yes, without giving them the additional information that choice
Correct.
entails being car dependent for almost every trip.
That is correct.
Okay. Sorry, it's not a conversation between you and I. Developers and builders are constantly telling us that building apartments is too expensive. It's just not feasible. Housing is cheaper and our homes are already too expensive. So how can we build more apartments?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question of who's carrying which cost. And that's what I also try to get through to the councils just recently. If we expand through urban sprawl, the initial cost is lower. But the problem is the long-term cost is a lot higher because you've got a lot more pipes, roads, infrastructure to deal with. And that's not only in the neighborhood, but also to upgrade all the other infrastructure, the core infrastructure to actually service those sort of neighborhoods. And those sort of costs are actually going to stick with us forever for us as a community. We've got to deal as a council that we need to maintain that. So that is the so-called operational cost that just goes up, 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 up if we keep creating these sort of neighborhoods. Whereas if you build denser neighborhoods in town, the initial capital investment is higher. It's more complex, it's more difficult to do. But for councils, the operational expenditure in perpetuity is a lot lower, which means, you know, if you think about it as a business, that is where you need to put your money because you want your operational expenses per capita to be lower. So you've got more ratepayers paying for less pipes and or sharing pipes and streets. So this is a question of who's paying what. So in a way, you can say that a community, the councils are actually subsidizing our sprawl because we allow that to be built relatively cheaply and then we take over the infrastructure and pay for it in perpetuity. So I have made a suggestion to the councils that, you know, if we wanted to level the playing field, well, you can basically say, you know, if we're really serious as a society that we don't want that happening in the future, you can adopt something like an urban-rural boundary like Auckland has and say, no, stop, we're not actually building beyond this. Now we focus on intensification. The important thing here is that the councils also need to increase the permitted height within the city and need to make, you know, create a lot of capacity that way, because otherwise economists are very clear that the housing cost is basically simply going up. If you've got you know, no capacity to go up and you have no capacity to go out, then all of a sudden you've got no capacity and a lot of demand, and then the price goes up. So that is something councils could do. If that's too radical, and I assume it is for our councils, they can actually charge targeted rates for new greenfield developments that actually take into account the real cost, the infrastructure cost in perpetuity, because that's always going to be higher than in town. So all of a sudden that starts to level the playing field out a little bit. Does it make housing cheaper? Probably not. But we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Can we afford to just have cheap housing out in the wops with all the negative impacts that we get from that in the long run?
Well, Adam, I'm not sure whether I understand this question, but he says with Plan Change 29 proposal out there, is there any opportunity to raise this consideration with the council? So I guess he's saying, well, we're waiting for Plan Change 29 to rumble through its process. Is there any opportunity to raise this with the council? Or do we need to wait until Plan Change 29's gone through?
Look, I'm not a planner. So I don't know all those processes in and out. But yeah, I mean, Plan Change 29 is an interesting one, because one of my bugbears is the way we go about intensification. And Plan Change 29 seems to be a very much a broad brush approach, just go up as a permitted activity and build it whichever way you want. I think that some people will have made submissions that also point towards carbon emissions. Plan Change 29 has some other issues, in that it's not very clear about the urban form that it wants to create. So that is something that I believe is also really important, to make sure that when we intensify in a way that's attractive and that is not creating environments where you have no outlook, no privacy, lots of concrete, and people feel like they only want to live there if they can't live anywhere else.
Okay, Adam says, are you familiar with green space orientated design, aka GOD? Doesn't provide all the commercial services within a 15-minute region, but gives communities a more livable and dense suburbia with shared green space, cost-effective management of stormwater, efficient links to public transport. Not saying it's perfect, but is this the meet in the middle approach? Are you familiar with this?
Well, I mean, transit-oriented development is certainly the first step that we need to take towards intensification.
Sorry, this was green space orientated design.
No, I'm
not sure.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware. I'm not familiar with this with that term. But what he's described, if it's it sounds a little bit like it might be transit-oriented design, where you see a little bit more intensification around nodes that then serve public transport well.
Yeah. Lindsay says, US planning organisation Strong Towns makes a convincing case about the effectiveness of a rates base by comparing low density and more intensive development as well as big box retail, etc. Do you have any info on that for our region?
Strong Towns is fantastic, and I look at their posts on a regular basis, and I mean the rates based approach that was raised here, that's basically what I mean by targeted rates, where you look at the actual cost to the community of certain neighborhoods and get the neighborhoods to actually pay their fair share, and that I think would also drive a little bit of a different pattern in our housing choices. But no, unfortunately, I'm not aware of any such information available in the Nelson Tasman region.
Okay, are you aware of any local developers who are pro-intensification?
Yeah, I am. There certainly are some developers that try to make it work. I think we need to support them a lot more. I think councils can do a lot more to support them. I think we need policy shift in order to get that to work properly, and that would also, over time, see intensification becoming a lot more affordable, because once you see the same level of standardization, and where not every building project is bespoke and expensive in the design stage and the consenting stage, you'll actually see the price drop. You'll also see the price drop when you see a little bit more competition in the market. At the moment, we've got a few bespoke units of intensified living in town, and a lot of people actually want to live like that. So they can pretty much charge whatever they want to for those units, and they kind of seem to. So I think that needs to become cheaper. It becomes cheaper when those units get smaller, and when we get that to become the new standard rather than a bespoke special order, if you know what I mean.
I think that's pretty much everything that's there. Have you got anything else you'd like to add that you haven't yet?
I do actually. No, I'm surprised this hasn't come up. Look, there's something I prepared earlier. Let me share my screen again. So one thing I expected to come up as a question was, what about EVs? Wouldn't that be our silver bullet? Doesn't that solve all our problems? All of a sudden, there's no greenhouse gas emissions, or at least that's what we're sort of led to believe. Except I love this little picture here that just shows that EVs are just as bad when it comes to congestion, road deaths, or the inherent inefficiency of using 1 ton of vehicle to move 1 person. So you still need a lot of energy. Where that energy comes from is the next question. The enormous space requirements are kind of worrying for our cities and transport systems. And I think Jan Gehl has a fantastic quote there, and I think I might have seen this quote associated with somebody else on Monday. If you plan cities for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. If you plan them for people and places, you get people and places. I think that is very pertinent. But I basically looked at research again to see, well, does it actually work in New Zealand? If we get significant EV uptake, does that actually reduce our carbon footprint, or do we just increase our fossil fuel power production? And I found something. Patrizio Gallardo is looking at that at the University of Canterbury, and he found that with the current grid capacity, a shift to EV has minimal impact on emissions. We just import more coal or burn more coal. If we get a significant uptake and we don't add more power generation, then we have a substantial risk of grid failure, blackouts. So we need a complete overhaul of our transmission infrastructure, which is hellishly expensive. So Gallardo finished basically to say it's much cheaper and more efficient if we look at public transport to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. A little bit out of context, but I thought that question might come up.
Right. It's probably a question that people who aren't on this Zoom would be asking. We've got a specific audience, I think, here.
Yeah, we've got a bit of an issue that we often preach to the converted.
Yes.
With this one, I know that there's a little bit of interest from some people who are kind of sitting on the fence, who might actually be watching this over the weekend. So hopefully that'll answer a few questions.
Yeah. And look, if I can just throw something in there for the person who asked about higher density being expensive. Sam Stubbs at a housing summit last week said he's building for 2.5K, $2,500 per square meter for his apartment. Well, very fields, I imagine. So, which is fascinating, isn't it? Cool. Timo, thank you very much. Joanna, are you there to wrap up? Oh, muted.
Okay. Yes, I am. Thank you, Peter. So thanks to Peter for expertly facilitating the questions, and great thanks to Timo for a fascinating presentation. And I particularly appreciated the data that you brought to your presentation, Timo. This presentation will, within a short time, become available in recorded version on the Nelson Tasman Climate Forum website. And I'll also mention to you before we close off that we're halfway through our Climate Action Festival week. There are more wonderful events in the remaining days, this evening, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that you'll find on the website. So this has been an outstanding one, Timo. Thanks again, and thanks to everyone for listening, and hopefully subsequently using the knowledge.
Thanks, Joanna.
Bye to
Thanks,
all.
Timo.